Welcome back to Debut Diaries. This is a new episode, and this series is all about my experience being a debut author. My book, Blood Like Magic, comes out in summer 2021, and so this is all the stuff leading up to and encompassing debut authorship in traditional publishing. Link below, I'll have all the previous episodes also over here. And today I am talking all about second book syndrome and lessons I learned from writing a sequel. For context, my book, Blood Like Magic, is a series. So it's a 2-book series, and we sold a 2-book series. So I was always going to be on contract to write that second book at some point. Usually in traditional publishing, you don't write the other books in the series before you've sold the first one. So it is common practice that you will have had the entire first book written and sell that, but that you won't have any of the second book written at that point. But you're on contract to deliver that to the publisher at some point. And so that may be your first experience writing a series or writing, a second or third book in your series, because previously you didn't sell a series, so then you didn't continue writing the rest of the books. That's very common practice, because if you can't sell the first book, then why did you spend all that time writing the rest of the series? So that's really common. So you can sell a 2-book series or a 3-book series. I'm sure you can sell more, but at least in young adult, it's more common to sell a 2-book or 3-book series. And there's also cases in which you sell a standalone book and then you'll have an option clause. So say you sold a standalone young adult thriller. So your option clause may say you have to show us your next young adult book, or you have to show us your next young adult thriller, for example. Excuse me. So the option clause essentially says that the same publisher that you sold your first book to, you have to show them your next book within the constraints of that clause first. So that's how the option clause works. So some people's book 2 will be their option book, and some people's book 2 will be the next book in their series. So if their option book is book 2, they still have to sell that book. So the option book, you haven't sold it yet. So some people are working on their book 2. They'll create a proposal and then they'll submit the proposal to the publisher, and based on that, they'll decide to buy it. Sometimes they'll write the full book, but I think it's fairly common to write a proposal. But in the case of when you're writing a series like me, I just went on into writing the rest of the book. Sometimes people will present what they're going to do for their second book to their editor and then kind of get approval, and then they'll move on. I think it really depends. For me, my editor had already seen a synopsis of the second book when she bought the first one. So I had already planned out the entire second book when we were on submission. I didn't do it right on submission, but I did it later on. So when she bought it, she knew what was going to happen in the second book already based on my synopsis. And my agent was kind of like, so go ahead and write the sequel. So I just started writing the sequel without doing any sort of specific approval process. And I haven't had anything said to me, so I assume it's all right. But that's kind of the different situations that a debut author can find themselves in. So when people say book 2, sometimes it's the next book in the series, and sometimes it's an option book that they are trying to sell to their publisher or have just sold to their publisher. Now I want to talk a little bit about second book syndrome. So second book syndrome, as I understand it vaguely, is essentially this problem that a debut author comes with in which they are really super struggling with their second book. Sometimes they're struggling because they have to write something from scratch and show it to an editor, and they're worried it's not going to be as good as the first book that your editor saw, especially when you think of querying and that sort of thing. A lot of the time you've worked on that first book that you sold for a very long time, and suddenly this second second book, you have a limited time period. So if you spent 5 years on and off working on your first book, and then now it's like, okay, we'll get that second book done in a year, that can be really stressful. And that can be a part of second book syndrome. Another part of it can be just worrying that your second book is not going to be as good as your first book, and that everybody will hate it, and then your editor will hate it, and everyone will be like, this was a mistake. And that's a part of second book syndrome. And I think another part is just not being able to figure out what to write. I think sometimes that comes from not knowing where to start, like if you hadn't had a plan from the beginning, but also if you're like getting distracted by other books that you would kind of rather write, and having to force yourself to write this book because that's the book on contract, and so you need to do that book if you want to continue to be paid for the books that you've sold. So for me, I didn't experience so much of second book syndrome. I did have some experience with it, but it was primarily me comparing my second book to my first book, because my first book is so polished and my second book is a little baby. And it's really difficult when you are, especially for me, doing a sequel, like you're really trying to make a book that is as good, if not better, than your first book. And that's really hard. It's really, really difficult because a lot of people really prefer the first book and maybe they don't like the sequel as much. And so that for me was a lot of pressure. I really want to make this sequel as good, if not better, than the first book. And it's really hard when you are doing your first draft of a book and you're comparing your gross first draft to your super polished, like, been through beta readers several times, been through your agent, been through your editor several times, polished work, and like trying to compare that to this thing that you've written in however many months that you have not edited whatsoever. So that was really difficult for me because I couldn't quite figure out how to make it better. And I think the thing with sequels and sequel writing is that there's not a lot of resources on writing sequels. There are so many craft books on like writing your first book, and I think that's because that's the widest audience. So you want to reach as many people as possible with your book. So a lot of writing craft books are focused on first books, on writing one book, and less focused on series and creating a series and writing sequels and how to do that really well. And so that was a big struggle for me because it was hard to find any resources to be like, how do I do this? And I have told myself that if I successfully write a sequel, that I will try and like come up with more resources to help with that, because it was really, really difficult. Essentially what I ended up doing was that I thought of all the sequels I had read, and then I had read a few sequels, and I listed out all of the things that I had liked about them. So I listed things like, okay, this sequel I really liked, and why did I really like it, and why was that so good for me? And sequels that I didn't like, and I was like, why didn't I like this, and why wasn't this great for me? I discovered this thing about myself. I don't like sequels where they go somewhere else from where they were originally. And that's just like me. I think I like when people set up the world and they stay in that world and they keep coming back to it. That's something I really enjoy. But when they leave that world, then it becomes really difficult for me. So like the first and the second Hunger Games books are my favorite Hunger Games books because they're both in the arena. One is in the arena and then they just go right back to the arena. And I love that. But the third book, where they like go off into wherever, I didn't like because they had left the setting that I had enjoyed so much. So for my book, that was less of an issue because I knew they weren't really going to go anywhere else. So that was helpful, but it really was a lot of my own kind of piecing together little things and doing a lot of my own research because there weren't a lot of resources. And so that kind of was like my second book syndrome experience. I think since then I've gotten over that quite a bit. I've really gotten it into my brain that I can't compare something that I haven't even like gotten into any sort of useful shape to something that I've worked on for over a year. I really cannot. And so that's the way I've kind of pushed out of that. And I think it also helped in that when I set my daily word count goals, I was just pumping it out. Like, regardless of quality, I was like, you just need to get it done. And so to me, that really helped out a lot because I didn't have all of this time to kind of sit and be like intimidated by writing. I just sat down and write it. And so that's really how I experienced second book syndrome and also how I broke out of it. Some things I learned about myself during drafting a sequel is that I really needed to start off a little bit slower. When I first started drafting my sequel, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do like 2,000, I think it was like 2,000 words a day, something like that. And it was super tough for me. I did that for a week and I was really tired. And then I had to take a break because some debut edits had come in. And then when I started again, I was like, you can't do that pace because it's too much for you. And so then I switched to 1,000 words a day. And that made it so much more doable for me and it made it less painful. And then I found that I spent less time comparing it to my first book when I was doing that pace. I think because I was less stressed out. So really adjusting how I was doing things. And then of course I read that book, 5,000 Words in an Hour by Chris Fox. I'll link that below. And then I was able to significantly increase my writing speed. So I still stuck with 1,000 words for a while, but I was doing it a lot faster. For me, my first drafts are bad. They're bad. And they're bad whether I write them slowly or whether I write them fast. It makes no difference whatsoever. That was also something I learned. And then once I learned to draft faster, I could draft things faster. And so now I'm at the point where I can do like 1,000 words in 20 minutes. So I do 2 20-minute sprints and then I have 2,000 words for the day, and that's great for me. Sometimes I write more because I was trying to do crunch time to finish it, so I wrote a little bit more, but essentially that became a base that was doable for me. And that was something I tried to do in the beginning. I tried to write 2,000 words in the beginning, but at that point it was too much for me. And so I really had to adjust things, and then I ended up being able to do 2,000 words a day later, which was great. But still, I think that's a big thing about doing sequels and doing book twos is really trying to adjust so that you have the time to do it. And I know people are on contract and it really depends on your publisher and editor. I actually still don't have a deadline for my sequel, so I'm done quite a bit early, but it really depends. Sometimes people will have a tighter timeline, but what was really helpful to me was starting as soon as possible. And that was something that was reiterated by my agent, was like trying to start the sequel as soon as I could, within reason, of course. I was like, I need to get the first book mostly finished before I can start writing the sequel because I want to see what might change. And my agent was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Perfect. But that was something that was reiterated to me to kind of try and start as soon as possible. And that was really helpful because now I'm done early enough that I'll have time to have CPs or betas read it. I'll have time to have my agent read it if I want to and do all those edits before it even gets to my editor. So that was really helpful for me. Reading was super helpful for me. Reading sequels and making those notes that I talked about earlier, like that was really invaluable to me because that was kind of the only way that I could do research. Something else that I learned about myself in the process of writing the sequel is that I really enjoy being able to focus on minor characters from the first book more. Like that's my favorite thing when like in the first book a character pops up and you are like, okay, whatever, I guess that's a character. And then in the second book they're so much more important. And then you have people reading the second book and they're like, I love this character. The first book people are like, what? And they're like, no, they get so much better. I really like that. I think that's really exciting to see that focus shift and have those characters become a lot bigger in the narrative. Something that I have to get better at and that I have to do in my revisions is not then dwindling the characters that were bigger in the first book to make more space for these minor characters I pumped up. That's something that I have to learn. And then also something that I really came away with it is I felt weirdly super proud of my main character. I think just seeing that whole arc from the very beginning of the series to the end, like that made me really proud of her. And I was like, oh my gosh, look at all that you have achieved. And I think that was just kind of a moment that I didn't expect to get into, but that I did experience writing my sequel. And I'm just kind of chatting about that generally because it was something that really helped me feel better about the second book in comparing it constantly to the first book, is that I could have this moment of being proud of my main character. And I think especially like if you're feeling second book syndrome, something that's really great is to think of the moments in your sequel that you're proud of. Even if I'm like, my whole first drafts are trash, I can still pick out little moments where I'm like, this is good, or this can build up to be really good. And I think that's important to kind of give yourself something to feel good about, because as much as we are writers and we're like, oh yeah, you know, everything I read is trash, I send this to my CPs and I'm like, sorry for sending you this trash, it's still important within yourself to find something to be proud of in your work. That's my experience writing sequel and second book syndrome. I think if I have to give like the TLDR for this video for tips on writing sequels, it's read a lot of sequels and write down things that you liked about them and things that you didn't like about them, any devices that you notice them use, things that they do. For example, like that whole the minor character in the first book ends up being really important in the second book, things like that that you notice that you like, or things that you don't like, so that you can kind of use that to decide what you are and aren't going to do in your sequel, to really not put pressure on yourself to immediately make it as good as the first book, because it's not going to be from the beginning. You had to go through so many drafts to get your first book there, and it's going to be the same with your second book. To really focus on increasing the stakes and upping the stakes and making sure that your character has room to develop more in response to those stakes. So if you raise the stakes, then, there's something your character has achieved by the first book that they need to work even harder to achieve in the second book. And that's something I think that's important to pay attention to. And then finally, finding those moments within your sequel that you are proud of and holding on to those so that you can have something to feel proud of, because you have written yet another book, and that's really important. And going into it like that as well. So those are kind of my quick and dirty sequel tips. As I said, if my sequel ends up being successful / well received, then maybe I'll make more videos about this. But until then, that's just kind of my advice for writing my sequel, that were things that worked for me. So that's my whole experience, and that's this whole episode of Debut Diaries. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to me already, please subscribe, and please add my book to Goodreads, because it really actually does help out, and it's really awesome, and I would super appreciate it. And what else? Oh, if you have any questions about like writing a sequel or book twos, please put them in the comments and I will answer to the absolute best of my ability. And thank you so much for watching. Bye!